As the tensions of the Cold War escalated during the early 1960s, so did the arms race between the world's superpowers, and the Soviets were at their peak of technological development. Although very few people could infiltrate the Iron Curtain, there was a strong rumor that the Soviets were working on a tank far more potent than the T-62 and the T-54-55. The Americans and West Germans, who had just recently built the M60 and Leopard 1 tanks, were afraid of this new secret weapon and decided to join forces to create a vehicle that would be more powerful and way ahead of anything built at the time. This marked the first time the two nations worked together on a tank project, and the result was the MBT-70. However, having the US Army and the Bundeswehr join forces would prove a far more challenging endeavor than expected. By 1965, the United States Army had made the M60 its main battle tank, while its NATO counterpart, the West German Bundeswehr, had recently developed the well-rounded Leopard 1. Both tanks proved outstanding and performed without issues against any other armored vehicle the Soviet Union could field at the time. However, the paranoia around the secretly improved version of the Soviet T-62 main battle tank was taken seriously by the military staff of the United States and West Germany, as the engineers from both countries believed their new tanks would not match the Soviet Colossus and decided to act accordingly. Both nations shared the same threat, the same enemy, and were confronted in the same theater of operations. They were sure they could work together on a new project to overcome the Soviet Union. Still, many wondered if that would be possible at all. It was then that American Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stepped in to do something no one had ever thought of: get the Americans and West Germans to jointly develop a new super tank. Robert McNamara put the best of his industrial management capabilities, learned at Ford Motor Company before becoming Secretary of Defense, into the production of military resources. Several NATO states then fielded dozens of weapon systems that had little in common, especially regarding standard ammunition calibers and vehicle spare parts. Still, McNamara managed to convince the U.S. Armor Branch and the German Bundeswehr to develop a tank that could meet the standards of both armies. His high regard for German engineering led to the August 1963 Memorandum of Understanding, and both nations agreed to organize a joint design team to develop the MBT-70 tank. Former tank commander U.S. General Wellborn G. Dolvin was chosen to lead the U.S. team, whose contractor was General Motors. Meanwhile, the Bundeswehr formed the German Development Corporation, which comprised the most prominent German industrial firms. Discussions between the two teams began almost immediately, as every side wanted to design the tank according to its own philosophy. Still, neither side was entirely convinced, and there were many differences, starting with the use of either the metric system or SAE units for the specifics of the gun, turret, and general equipment. McNamara tried to solve the issue, but only managed to reach an agreement in which both sides would use their own measurements on the parts they designed. Despite the disputes, the Germans and Americans immediately got to work. Some of the MBT-70 features were truly ahead of their time, and the tank was designed from scratch to innovate with a new tank concept. The MBT-70 was 3.5 meters long, but reached over 9.3 meters with the gun placed forward. Unlike the American M60, which was a tank of colossal proportions, the MBT-70 had a low silhouette. It was over 1.8 meters tall from the turret to the floor. Its standard height was over 2.6 meters, but thanks to an effective hydropneumatic suspension system, it could be heightened or lowered depending on the road to bolster cross-country performance or enhance the desired combat capabilities. Moreover, the tank could kneel forward or backward to improve the gun's accuracy and range when targeting long-distance objectives. Additionally, the hydropneumatic suspension system served a defensive purpose, as it could fortify hull-down positions to protect the tank from the rear. The low silhouette blueprint resulted in a redesigned interior, as there was no room in the hull for the driver and the crew. Instead, their stations were located in the tank's turret, which offered protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical threats. However, the driver's seat had to be placed in an individual cupola that was constantly rotating so that he could see in the same direction, despite the turns of the turret. Plus, it could also be spun so the tank could be driven backward at full speed. Although innovative, this resulted in motion sickness for the drivers, who were used to always remaining stationary. As for the main armament, the Germans settled for an auto-loading 120mm Rheinmetall gun. However, the Americans preferred the 152mm XM150 gun and launcher. Besides firing a wide variety of tank rounds, such as high-explosive, anti-tank, and armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, the tank was also expected to fire the Shillelagh-guided missile with a laser rangefinder, which had a range of some 3,000 meters. Secondary armament comprised a remote-controlled 20mm RH-202 autocannon to take down armored vehicles and aircraft, and a machine gun was mounted coaxially for close quarters. Finally, the tank was fitted with an M73, while the German prototype was armed with an MG3 machine gun. The MBT-70's armor was made up of 2 layers. The outer layer was made of high-performance armor, produced in plates that were 40mm thick, and it was designed to withstand impacts from anti-tank rounds. In addition, the front of the hull and turret were covered by spaced armor, and the inner layer protected the 3-man crew from spalling or internal armor fragmentation. Despite the MBT-70's approximate weight of 51 tons, it had excellent mobility thanks to the innovative suspension system. It could achieve a top speed of over 69 kilometers per hour and was faster than the M60, the Leopard 1, and the Soviet T-64. Combined with its top-notch cross-country capabilities, no main battle tank in the market could match the reliability of the MBT-70. Still, the tank was far from perfect. Drivers constantly complained about the rotating cupola, and the American XM150 gun and launcher failed to fire the Shillelagh missile effectively without issues. Also, to maintain the incredible speed of the MBT-70, the American model had to be fitted with a turbine engine that proved problematic given its exceptional care. 14 MBT-70 hulls were built between the Americans and the Germans, and testing ran from 1966 to 1968. However, the cost of the project dramatically escalated. Each MBT-70 was estimated to cost over $1 million in 1969, and the whole project was initially expected to cost $80 million, but had risen to over $300 million as 1970 approached. The United States and West German governments were no longer convinced of the tank and the ongoing issues between both teams. As a result, they decided to part ways before spending more money on a tank that would never see the light of day. However, it was not all in vain. The Bundeswehr would go on to develop the effective Leopard 2, with many of the ideas implemented in the MBT-70 prototype. As for the US, the Army would eventually develop the XM803 prototype, which resulted in the current M1 Abrams tank. The MBT-70 project became the last time 2 nations joined forces to produce a main battle tank. As the frigid fingers of the Cold War gripped the world, the Soviet Union raced to grow its arsenal of destruction, while the United States and Europe rushed to assemble their own armory to deter the likelihood of an enemy attack. Soon, almost every warhead and launching system could fire nuclear weapons and conventional ammunition, drawing the world closer to a nuclear war. During this time, the Soviets constructed a particularly dreadful nuclear-capable cruise missile that would be designated by NATO as the Sunburn. Concocted as an anti-ship missile, the supersonic ramjet-powered projectile was a fearsome seaborne weapon capable of obliterating entire enemy fleets. By combining a sea-skimming flight pattern with Mach 3 speeds, the Soviet warhead was virtually immune to interception, something that seriously alarmed the powers of NATO. But as the world-threatening technology was deployed for the first time, it would be suddenly challenged not only by the NATO allies, but from within the Soviet Union itself. Birth of the Mosquito. It was the 1970s, and the hands of the doomsday clock continued to draw ever closer to midnight. Across both sides of the Iron Curtain, the world's superpowers prepared for almost any warfare scenario imaginable, building terrifying weapons for every situation. For one, the Soviet Union was concerned with a possible NATO amphibious invasion through the Baltic or Black Seas, prompting them to design a new groundbreaking anti-ship missile capable of defending Soviet lands and overpowering the US Harpoon missile. With such urgency in mind, the Soviet engineers began developing the musket or mosquito missile, an ambitious and extremely powerful warhead that would be utterly immune to any NATO attempt at interception. The Raduga Design Bureau designed the missile system during the mid-1970s as a replacement for the P-120 Malachite, also known to NATO as the Siren. The Siren had been created as a submarine missile, capable of launching even when the vessel was submerged. However, a series of technical difficulties made its implementation slow and painful. Soon, the Soviets needed a new solution to face off against NATO fleets and their powerful new Harpoon missiles. The resulting weapon was an engineering success that showcased outstanding tactical features and could cruise at 2,300 miles per hour at high altitudes and 1,688 miles per hour at low ones. Such capabilities immediately made it 3 times faster than the American Harpoon missile. Additionally, the device showed outstanding agility, was able to perform intensive anti-defense evasion maneuvers in minimal time, and flew as low as 19 feet from the ocean's surface. Combined, the raw speed, maneuverability, and low-altitude capabilities made the Mosquito virtually untouchable once it had been launched. The musket came out of its developing cycle in 1984, which is when the first units were deployed to the Soviet Navy. The combat possibilities of what NATO would codename the Sunburn verged on endless. The musket soon began to be integrated into Soviet destroyers and corvettes as the ultimate anti-ship missile. In theory, it could engage entire carrier battle groups, piercing their significant air defense capabilities without the risk of being shot down. While using conventional payloads, the Mosquito can carry 300 kilograms of explosives, and as the missile impacted an enemy ship, it would first pierce the armor with kinetic energy. Once embedded deep within the enemy's ship's systems, the delayed impact fuse would be activated, detonating the payload. Although the immediate sinking of a large carrier was improbable after a single hit, the musket would most likely disable the ship and prevent it from participating in the battle. Moreover, things change when the nuclear capabilities of the weapon are considered. The exact nature of the nuclear warheads the missile can employ remain veiled in mystery. However, NATO specialists estimate that the platform is able to deliver tactical nuclear warheads with the potential of sinking entire fleets and causing immeasurable collateral damage. As for its range, the musket has an effective operational range of about 90 kilometers, with the latest iterations of the missile reaching up to 120 kilometers. Compared to other anti-ship missile systems, the effective range is significantly lower. Still, the Mosquito makes up for what it lacks in range with its breakneck speeds and sea-skimming capabilities, both of which can be maintained from launch until final impact. Finally, the musket employs a radar seeker with passive and active homing capacities to find its target. The system lacks a secondary optical seeker and uses inertial navigation to approach a target area. As the missile cruises, target location updates can be sent to the missile to correct its course, and they are sent via data link from the Ka-25TS airborne radar helicopter, Tu-95RT maritime patrol aircraft, or even the Legenda nuclear-powered naval reconnaissance satellite. Design-wise, the musket is a long tubular missile powered by a ramjet engine fed by 4 unique air inlets, which give the weapon its unique futuristic look. The primary missile design was copied from the 3MB surface-to-air missile system developed in the early 1960s. To withstand the heat and friction from flying at Mach 3 speeds, the missile's air inlets, wings, and body are made of reinforced titanium. When it is launched, the musket is launched to initial flight speed by a solid propellant rocket engine located within the combustion chamber of the ramjet. The boosting motor is then ejected as the ramjet takes over during the cruising phase. Meanwhile, the seeker is located within the radar transparent nose cone, followed by the guidance and radio altimeter unit, and the warhead section is situated between the guidance unit and the fuel tank at the back of the missile. Due to its many remarkable capabilities, the missile is considerably large and heavy. It's almost 10 meters long and weighs approximately 10,000 pounds, making it incompatible with many naval platforms. In contrast to the Harpoon or Exocet seaborne missile systems, the Mosquito could not be universally carried by all ships within their respective navies. As such, the main platforms for the missile were the Project 956 Sarek-class guided missile destroyer, the Project 1241.1 Molniya class, and the surface effect Project 1239 class corvettes. With its raw power, Mach 3 speeds, and sea-skimming capabilities, the Musket had all the features needed to outclass NATO's seaborne missile solutions. On top of that, the system's nuclear capabilities made it a fearsome threat to Western naval powers and a weapon well ahead of its time. Still, the missile was expensive to produce and to be incorporated into Soviet ships. Just as the first units began to make their way to naval platforms, the financial situation in the Soviet Union slowed production to a halt. The Musket was envisioned as a tactical powerhouse and a financial venture, as the Soviets had made detailed plans to sell the technology to China and Warsaw Pact members. However, as the Soviet Union began to collapse in the early 1990s, the funds needed for international exports ran out, and our own Soviet Navy retained only a small number of operational units. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia sold some of the missiles it had to China. Still, with production halted, the ambitious and powerful Musket missile would never be built again. To this day, many Musket missiles remain in active service in the Russian and Chinese navies. Still, they are an expiring technology, a derelict remnant of what could have been. The scenario was clear. As the Cold War turns hot, a field of warfare, eerily quiet yet tense, stretches before a small team of American soldiers. Under a heavy sky, they hastily set up a newly developed weapon, their movements precise yet urgent. A recoilless rifle system, named the Davy Crockett, is aimed at a distant target, the Soviet tank. Once the weapon is set, the team pulls the firing cord. As they sprint away, the air is thick with the unspoken truth. The Davy Crockett is more than just a rifle. It's the world's smallest nuclear weapon. A powerful tool in their arsenal, with the Davy, nuclear abilities were now at the fingertips of even the smallest military units. Today, the use of nuclear weapons is understood only as a last resort. Yet, back in the 1950s, amidst a frosty atmosphere of global tension, the rules were different. And the Davy Crockett epitomized a readiness to cross the boundaries of the unthinkable. It was the 1950s. The Cold War was at its peak, and the deployment of nuclear weapons against Japan had ushered in a new age of warfare. To many people around the globe, it seemed like sooner rather than later, the Soviet Red Army would exploit its numerical superiority with a powerful and overwhelming nuclear attack against the West. With a single weapon, and in the blink of an eye, entire cities could be destroyed. Initially, war planners believed the only way to counter this looming threat was to simply have more atomic weapons. Even President Eisenhower stated in his memoirs that, quote, "My feeling was then, and still remains, that it would be impossible for the United States to maintain the military commitments which it now sustains around the world without turning into a garrison state, did we not possess atomic weapons and the will to use them when necessary." When Eisenhower first became the president in 1953, the total American nuclear stockpile was approaching 1,000. By the time he left 8 years later, that number had grown to over 20,000. However, their widespread use would have almost certainly caused mutually assured destruction or MAD. It was clear the United States needed a middle ground. By the late 1950s, military planners were beginning to think nuclear materials were not merely assets to deter conflict. They could also be made into munitions, ready for use in actual warfare. Beginning in 1957, the U.S. Army's airborne and infantry divisions were reorganized into pentonic divisions, tailored for combat on nuclear battlefields. The strategic shift, aimed at countering the nuclear threat, led to the development of compact, tactical nuclear tools that could deliver the power of atomic weaponry directly into the hands of frontline soldiers. In late 1957, the Atomic Energy Commission announced that people at the agency had successfully designed a lightweight, sub-kiloton yield fission warhead. The commission charged the Army's Chief of Ordnance, Major General John H. Hinrichs, to incorporate this recently finished miniature warhead with a brand new weapons system. Under the Battle Group Atomic Delivery System, or BGADS program, work on the project began, becoming the first ever assigned to the United States Army Weapon Command in Rock Island, Illinois. Because Army Chief of Staff General Maxwell D. Taylor considered the development of the BGADS as a critical component of the Army's new pentomic divisions, this project became one of the most dedicated developments in the entire Army, with officials exploring as many as 20 different delivery systems, including guided missiles, standard artillery, and mortars. However, the Army chose the simplest and lightest option, a recoilless rifle system, and by August of that same year, the BGADS design was becoming known as the Davy Crockett, named after the American folk hero, frontiersman, soldier, and politician. In November, the Ordnance Corps delivered the first prototype recoilless rifle tube at Picatinny Arsenal. After years of development and tests throughout America, the M28-M29 Davy Crockett finally entered service in May 1961. Starting in 1961, the Army began fielding the Davy Crockett recoilless rifle system to American infantry units in West Germany, South Korea, Guam, Hawaii, and Okinawa. The weapon was designed to be used against rapidly advancing formations of Soviet, Warsaw Pact, and North Korean troops, thus allowing a very small number of American service members to take out about a dozen enemy tanks at once, giving the U.S. Army an extra punch should the Cold War turn hot. The heart of this weapon consisted of the XM-388 nuclear projectile. With a bulbous body and small tail fins that popped out to stabilize it mid-flight, the projectile was a strange sight. The XM-388, which looked like a cartoon caricature of a bomb, also earned the nickname of the atomic watermelon. It was also one of the smallest nuclear devices ever developed, weighing 76 pounds and measuring 30 inches long by 11 inches wide. Within the XM-388 was the small nuclear weapon deployed by the United States Armed Forces, the W-54 warhead. Weighing 51 pounds, it had an explosive yield of approximately 10 to 20 tons. The Davy Crockett was produced in two separate variants: the light M28 120mm recoilless rifle with a range of approximately 1.25 miles, and the less used heavy M29 155mm recoilless rifle, out to 2.5 miles. Both versions of the Davy Crockett were operated by 3 soldiers and mounted upon a jeep vehicle. One of the most fervent supporters of the weapon outside the U.S. was Franz Josef Strauss, West Germany's defense minister, who personally promoted the idea of equipping German brigades with the nuclear weapons supplied by the U.S., as he believed that a single Davy Crockett could replace up to 50 salvos of a whole divisional artillery park. But NATO commanders strongly opposed Strauss's ideas, and the weapon would remain in American hands only. And as the Davy Crockett system was deployed across various U.S. military units, the need to thoroughly test and demonstrate its capabilities became paramount. On July 17, 1962, at the Nevada test site in southern Nevada, a crowd of 396 spectators, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, and the U.S. Attorney General and brother of the newly elected President, Robert F. Kennedy, were braving the sun to witness the last atmospheric test ever conducted by the United States. From a distance of approximately only 2 miles, these men and women were about to see the first ever firing of a Davy Crockett recoilless rifle weapon system called the Little Feller One-Shot. The fourth and last test of the Dominic II series, Little Feller 1, was part of a series of 105 nuclear tests conducted by the United States in 1962 during a period of heightened tensions in the Cold War, particularly after the Soviet Union resumed nuclear testing. 10 days before, the Little Feller 2 test had only consisted of a troop maneuver and an observer program. But that day, for the ultimate test of the weapon that would reveal its true potential and limitations, Little Feller 1 would involve the largest number of military troops, over 1,000 personnel, to ever participate in a nuclear test. After arriving at the exercise ground area, the troops practiced firing the Davy Crockett launchers, while scientific personnel checked instrumentation in the target area. Up above, a single L-20 aircraft surveyed the area to ensure that not a single unauthorized person was in the vicinity. Half an hour before, the Atomic Energy Commission started the countdown for Little Feller 1, and all personnel in the test site went to their trenches. 5 personnel launched the weapon from the Davy Crockett launcher mounted on an armored personnel carrier as the clock counted down. As the weapon fired away, the observers in the bleachers watched with protective goggles. They bore witness to Little Feller 1's detonation 3 feet above the surface on a target 2,796 feet away from the firing position. Only a single live Davy Crockett round would ever be fired. By then, the collective view of nuclear warfare had begun to change, especially when new President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev stood eye to eye over Cuba in a frightening confrontation 3 months after the test. But the views on the weapon had also changed. From the very beginning, data gathered from testing inert rounds was shocking. It was too inaccurate to deliver even low-yield nuclear fires. This factor soon became a snowball effect of possibilities that derailed the entire program. The first problem was the serious concerns about their practicality in a real combat scenario, including the heightened risk of friendly fire or unintended collateral damage, especially given the nuclear nature of the Davy Crockett and the high-pressure dynamics of warfare. Another issue was the weapon's short range, especially posing a real threat to its 3-man crews. Should the wind veer even a bit too much, these soldiers would find themselves at risk of receiving a significant dose of radiation. Aware that those within the 1.25 miles of the blast of the M28 light version were potential targets for nuclear material, the Army told servicemen to only deploy the recoilless gun from behind a hill, to not move, and to keep their heads down until the warhead had detonated. Another, more ethical issue was that while the Americans would be aware of the precaution, the enemy, of course, would not. But the dangers of radioactive fallout weren't enough. The entire concept of nuclear battlefields was flawed. It was a nearly unanimous belief amongst the personnel associated with the development of the Davy Crockett that using the weapon would evolve into a large conflict. While nuclear power was at the fingertips of every soldier with the Davy Crockett, this meant that even a random and unwilling sergeant had the potential to start a nuclear war. Almost 1 year after the Little Feller test, in June 1963, President Kennedy announced that after years of talks, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom would take part in the Moscow Treaty, or the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This document, which became effective in October of that year, completely banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The treaty allowed underground atomic testing, as long as radioactive debris remained within the territorial borders of the testing nation. Despite its faults, a total of 2,100 Davy Crockett's were produced. The growing realization of the impracticality and potential dangers of Davy Crockett led to it being phased out of service with U.S. forces in Europe, beginning in 1967, leaving the 82nd Airborne Division's 55th and 56th Infantry platoons as the only remaining wielders of the recoilless gun, until those were deactivated in 1968. Still, smaller nuclear weapons remained part of the U.S. arsenal from then on. Even the W-54 warhead was reused in the 1980s as a small, backpack-sized nuclear landmine, ready to destroy bridges and collapse pads to stop invading Soviet forces. But the idea of limited nuclear war has not gone away entirely. In 2018, nuclear battlefield weapons came back on the news when President Donald Trump's nuclear posture review changed and called for the development of a duo of new nuclear systems with a battlefield role. Even more recently, in June 2022, the United States Congress approved funding for a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile with a low-yield warhead. And once again, even more than 50 years since the decommissioning of the Davy Crockett nuclear recoilless rifle, the potential snowball escalating effect is still a concern for U.S. military leaders. The M65 Atomic Cannon, also known as Atomic Annie by the soldiers, was an American artillery piece capable of firing nuclear warheads at a distance of up to 20 miles. Atomic Annie was the U.S. Army's largest artillery gun in the Cold War, weighing roughly 47 tons. Still, it was highly mobile and could easily be transported by 2 tractors. The weapon was developed as part of the American defensive measures of the 1950s to protect the borders of West Germany, South Korea, and Japan from possible Soviet invasions. However, as the development of tactical nuclear missiles escalated, the M65 struggled to stay relevant, and its participation in the Vietnam War soon became uncertain. Before the end of World War II, the Allied powers struggled to coordinate effectively, and tensions between them rose exponentially. The United States and Great Britain knew that their alliance with the Soviet Union was temporary, and Joseph Stalin knew it as well. They were all aware that their joint efforts would crumble quickly once their common enemy, the Third Reich, was defeated. Allied agents from each country spied on each other to figure out their real intentions, and the Soviets proved experts at this. They successfully infiltrated the armed forces and the governments of Britain and the United States, gaining access to the Manhattan Project and other military technologies. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Winston Churchill advocated landing in the Balkans to stop the aggressive Soviet expansion in the east instead of landing in Normandy, but was ignored. Each government had already negotiated with Stalin, and all Eastern European countries that fell under the Soviets would become part of the USSR. This gave way to the Cold War and the rise of the Iron Curtain. By then, Germany was divided, and everything beyond it was ruled with an iron grip by Stalin. After the Berlin airlift of 1948 and 1949, tensions at the borders in the West escalated quickly, and the Soviet Union turned more aggressive, threatening to invade the rest of Europe. The same scenario occurred in Asia, where US forces were stationed in occupied Japan. The spread of communism went rampant, and US allies around the globe felt threatened by the Soviet blitzkrieg. The fear of a Soviet invasion was palpable, and the United States had to do something to keep its allies safe. The Pentagon would then begin to research new defensive measures that could be used as a deterrent to the USSR, and the result was a unique piece of nuclear weaponry, a 280mm heavy gun capable of firing nuclear shells. The atomic bombs that put an end to World War II and devastated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki prompted an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the key reasons that led the US to drop the nuclear weapons over Japan was to give the Soviets a taste of American firepower and force Stalin to refrain from future conflicts. This worked for a while, but the army believed that it could once again hold the Soviets at bay with a small tactical nuclear weapon that could be stationed at the borders of Germany and Japan. The problem was that by 1949, the United States no longer held the monopoly in atomic destruction, and that same year, the Soviets were finally able to test their first nuclear bomb. Atomic projectiles had yet to appear in the form of missiles or shells, and only came as big and heavy bombs like the ones dropped over Japan. Still, this technological limitation did not stop the US Army from attempting to break the US Air Force's monopoly of delivering nuclear bomb loads. Determined to provide its ground units with nuclear support to use on the battlefield, the US Army issued an order requesting, quote, an ordnance engineer with an exceptional combination of imagination, courage, and boldness. That man was engineer and Navy radar project officer Robert M. Schwartz, who was immediately relocated to the Pentagon on temporary duty assignment to begin working on the nuclear artillery piece that the Army desired. Schwartz was then sequestered and guard-watched in a locked room for 15 days while he worked on the design of the secret nuclear weapon. While thinking of increasing the size of the largest artillery shell in U.S. history, Schwartz took inspiration from the Wehrmacht artillery pieces developed during World War II, and developed his artillery gun based on the existing German K5 railway guns, particularly on Anzio Annie. This weapon was a K5 employed by the Wehrmacht to shell the beachhead of Anzio from over 20 miles away while Allied forces disembarked at the port. Annie was significantly lethal and shredded long-range targets with ease and precision. Nonetheless, it was so massive that it became an easy target for Allied aircraft. To avoid getting hit, Anzio Annie was hidden under tunnels or tree cover and was moved by a fixed mounting that only allowed the cannon to adjust its vertical elevation. In addition, the 12-wheel bogies allowed the cannon to be transported on military and commercial standards. When Schwartz finished his design, and it was approved by the Army, he recruited a group of scientists and engineers to begin building the cannon at the Army's Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey. Then, after he developed the cannon's artillery shell, 3 years later, in 1952, the Army's atomic cannon was completed at the cost of $800,000. The weapon was baptized Atomic Annie as an homage to the German Anzio Annie cannon. It weighed 86,500 tons, had a significant length of 85 feet, and a width of roughly 10 feet. Atomic Annie only required 6 men to operate its 280mm nuclear-capable cannon, and it sat on a turntable that gave the crew a 360-degree field of fire. Also, its 280mm shell was loaded with a winch and a carriage powered by a portable electric generator. Atomic Annie was transported by 2 powerful all-terrain tractors that could travel at 35 miles an hour through paved or dirt roads and maneuver through fields without compromising the load. In addition, the cannon could be set up and disassembled in 15 minutes as a result of an effective hydraulic system, and the recoil of the 600-pound nuclear shell was absorbed by dual recoil buffers that were separated from the upper and lower carriages. Atomic Annie made its public debut on January 20th, 1953, during the inaugural parade for President Dwight Eisenhower. The witnesses consisted of war bands, servicemen, and armored vehicles, and Atomic Annie left everyone in awe. Months later, on May 25th, 1953, the atomic cannon was fired at a Nevada test site for the first and last time. Atomic Annie fired a 15-kiloton shell with a W9 warhead at a target located 7 miles away. Over 3,000 spectators, including reporters, witnessed the devastation that merely one shell could unleash, as the artillery shell had a blast radius equal to that of the bomb dropped over Hiroshima. It took 19 seconds for a flash of luminous light to unravel the atomic mushroom that erupted in the distance. After the great success of Atomic Annie, another 20 M65 artillery pieces were produced, sent overseas, and deployed at the borders of South Korea, Japan, and Germany. However, they were never used, and the Soviets never dared to attack. By 1963, the Army began to retire the M65s from the field to develop nuclear missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles. Atomic Annie can be appreciated today in the Army Field Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, while other M65s can be found in other museums across the United States.